Hello, everyone. Ted Lacksonen, the Country Thinker here, bringing you the next episode of The Eagle Has Crashed. Now, this is the third episode of Eaglenomics, a talk show-like chapter based loosely on the Kudlow Report, one of my favorite programs. And it is the conclusion of episode 2 of Eaglenomics, which is episode 20 of The Eagle Has Crashed. So I would recommend to anyone who finds this interesting to listen to episode 20 and this episode back to back and try and put all of it together, because it really was a continuous line of dialogue that I had to break up into two chunks. Now, the reason why I've done these particular sections is that in the process of researching The Eagle Has Crashed, as well as creating the fiscal and economic models for it, I really have gotten myself up to speed with economics to a great degree. And so I'm sort of a lay economist, if you will, since I'm not professionally trained in that regards. But I like to think of myself as an intermediary between people who aren't really familiar with these concepts and how they affect our lives and the professionals who do. Now, I did have these Eaglenomics sections reviewed by Kenyan economics professor Jay Corrigan, and I can assure you that nothing that I say in these are out of line. A ordinary, fairly mainstream, moderate economist says, yeah, you didn't say anything crazy here. You didn't say anything that really too many economists would complain about. So there really is some good stuff in here. Now, if this isn't your bag of tea, you can skip this week's episode and pick up with the story next week. And I encourage readers to do the same thing, but I really think this is important stuff, which is why I couldn't just leave it out. So anyhow, we're going to move on to Eaglenomics, Episode 3. Jasper. Welcome to Eaglenomics, everyone. I'm your host, Bernie Jasper. Back with me tonight is economics professor Murray Stevens of Music University, and we're going to finish a discussion we started 3 months ago. Gosh, has it been that long, Murray? Stevens. Sad to say, and a lot of waters flowed under the bridge since then. Jasper. So true. Anyhow, when we left off, you had given us a basic tutorial on government debt. Tonight, I would like you to apply it to our recent history. Stevens. Rubs his forehead. I wish I didn't have to. Jasper, well, walk us down memory lane. Stevens, let me start by laying down some guideline numbers. Economists have found that, historically, when publicly held debt exceeds 80% of GDP, you've reached a danger zone, and when it reaches 90%, the economy begins to falter. That's not a written-in-stone rule, but there have been many examples throughout history. For some countries, it happens at much lower debt levels. Anyhow, when we reached the 90% level, cracks appeared. The origins of our current problem began in the 2000s. As the baby boom generation approached retirement, and we should have been preparing for that demographic tsunami, we began running significant deficits. Jasper. But wasn't that partly because we implemented tax cuts to help the economy grow? Stevens. Yes, but they weren't balanced out with equivalent spending cuts. Actually, spending went up. Anyhow, in 2000, publicly held debt was around 35% of GDP. But by 2008, publicly held debt had increased to around 40%. It went over 60% in 2009, in part because of declining revenues from the recession and the beginning of the baby boomer retirement, but also because of an explosion in federal spending. Fortunately, that ended when the age of gridlock began in 2011. After the housing policy recession, we hit a very fortunate period. GDP growth consistent with the 1990s and 2000s, new taxes that push revenues over 22% of GDP with no adverse effects on the economy, and interest rates on our debt that were unusually low given the level of growth and slightly elevated inflation. Federal spending, which reached 25% of GDP in 2009 and 2010, stabilized in the upper 24% range. Publicly held debt remained above 60% of GDP, though, in part because of growing entitlement spending and in part because of growing interest payments on our debt. Next, President McDowell was elected and was greeted with the Fed's usual housewarming gift for an incoming executive, a recession. Like every other recession, it revealed how congressional budget meisters only think about good times and are always taken off guard by the bad. Lower revenues pushed public debt above 70% of GDP, and the process of removing the dollar as a sole international reserve currency went into full swing, inching interest rates higher. But the economy rebounded nicely, and overall government spending remained steady during the McDowell years, with the exception of a relatively inexpensive war in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. The primary fiscal changes were a 7-year spending freeze on non-defense discretionary spending, and McDowell's tax cuts, which lowered revenues but kept them in the 20.5 to 21.5% range relative to GDP, well above the post-war average of about 18% of GDP. Jasper. Those tax cuts are what made for such a strong recovery. Stevens. That's a debate I don't think ever will be settled. The bottom line is that revenues went down some, and whether they would have been even lower without her tax cuts is a question I can't answer. But the publicly held debt kept growing larger, and interest rates began to creep up. Just a little, but just enough to start making a difference. But they were still lower than one would have expected given the totality of the circumstances. Next, President Maynard took office and got the Fed's housewarming gift like his predecessors, another recession. Our publicly held debt went up from 76% of GDP in 2024, McDowell's last year, to 83% in 2025. That finally spooked investors enough to downgrade our credit. Nonetheless, we got a recovery and cranked revenues back up over 22% of GDP. Now comes the interesting part. Maynard signed a relatively minor economic stimulus package and also a relatively modest entitlement program with the Invest in America Act that was paid for with tax increases. But we were standing close to the edge of a cliff, and it only took one more step to go over the edge. A small increase in interest rates on an enormous pile of debt sent interest payments through the roof, from 4.3% of GDP in 2025 to 6% of GDP last year, headed for the moon. Interest payments were about 22% of our federal budget in fiscal 2029. In spite of spending restraint and higher taxes, our debt keeps growing, and now our debt service is eating our economy alive. And that, Mr. Jasper, is an example of how high deficits and public debt can destroy an economy. It's an autocatalytic effect that takes off in a hurry. Jasper. En inglés, senor. Stevens. A self-feeding mechanism. Put a match under a dry twig. It smolders and smokes, but once it reaches the necessary temperature, it bursts into flames. Maynard held a match under a smoldering twig by implementing additional spending on the heels of a recession that had already put our debt into dangerous waters. Let me point out how hard the government has worked to reduce spending over the last 18 years. Security spending has been reduced from 5.8% of GDP in 2010 to 3% of GDP last year. Non-security discretionary spending has been reduced from 3.8% to 2.2%. As a percentage of GDP, Congress has reduced discretionary spending relative to the economy, the only thing they're supposed to touch, by 35% since 2010. We have implemented universal health care and absorbed the baby boom retirement, but federal health care spending has only grown from 5% of GDP in 2010 to a little above 9% in 2028. Jasper. It's easy when you take a scalpel to services. Stevens. That's not really fair, Cal. Sure, benefit cuts have been a big part of it, but there have been some real cost-saving measures implemented. And we haven't implemented any other new entitlements in 2010 other than some minor parts of the Invest in America Act. The bottom line is that we've cut back on entitlement spending, even though Congress wasn't supposed to do that. Mandatory entitlement spending outside of Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security has decreased from 4.8% of GDP in 2010 to only 2.29%. All in all, the government has worked pretty hard to restrain itself, but the reality is we set the budgetary baseline too high many years ago, and growing interest expenditures have killed us. Another way to look at our problem is to look how our budget is constructed. Entitlement spending makes up about 61% of the budget. Interest takes up 22%. Discretionary spending, including security and non-security, along with other mandatory spending, only amount to 17% of our budget. Jasper, we're spending more on interest than on defense. Stevens, more than double. Jasper, could we have inflated our way out of the debt? Stevens, not likely. And the reason is that inflation makes interest rates go even higher, as investors get concerned that we are killing their investments. This is especially true when countries like the US are in danger of default. If the Fed had printed lots of money and tried to monetize the debt, interest probably would have devoured us even faster than inflation could have eroded the debt. I'm afraid that Currency Secretary Waters is taking us down that path. Jasper, yes, inflation has certainly heated up. One last thing. You said that we had a lot of good luck to get this far. Economically, what are you referring to? Stevens, well, up until the chaos that started when Texas seceded in January, we went several decades without any significant external shocks to our economy, such as a terrorist attack, a major disruptive war somewhere around the globe, a major spike in the prices of a commodity such as oil, or some other event. The rise in nationalism in China from 2012 to 2013 could have been a disaster, but fortunately never played out in any significant way. Jasper, as I've said before in this program, if China looks in, America goes down. Stevens, and if America goes down, look out. Jasper shakes head. Stevens, in any event, we haven't been in a position to respond to a major global threat or catastrophe for decades. Any big waves in the world would have swamped our economic ship because we have been riding low in the water for all of the debt in our holds. To move on, we were also lucky in that we didn't experience a decrease in economic activity due to the baby boomer retirement, which left a smaller population of peak earning year workers. Europe had a lot of problems with aging populations that we haven't seen here. Additionally, the smaller workforces produce impressive revenues with higher marginal tax rates than one would presume by comparing today's revenues with historical figures from when the baby boomers were working. So the good luck was this. We had an economy that survived higher taxes and an aging population without flinching. Strong revenues. Impressive congressional spending restraint. Extremely patient creditors. Inexplicably low interest rates. Relatively steady inflation. A dysfunctional legal system that drastically inflated government spending and depressed revenues, and a really dull world that did do anything unexpected to mess it all up. Jasper, looking at all the lucky breaks we got economically, the stars really aligned for us. That's what it took for the American economy to make it to 2029 without a major economic catastrophe? Stevens, I'm afraid so. We put 5 bullets in the 6-shooter in the first decade of the century and have been playing Russian roulette ever since. I still can't believe the gun didn't fire sooner. And like I said earlier, how it all happened is excellent fodder for doctoral theses. Jasper, I'd love to be an honorary member of your students' review panel. Stevens, I'll make the arrangements. Jasper, after that depressing segment, I need a commercial break. No, make that a shot of whiskey. And I don't drink. Well, as I said to everyone before we got started here today, I hope everyone listens carefully to the numbers. Now, the numbers are available at countrythinker.com, and I'm going to make them available at tedlacksonen.com in chart form, so you can take a look at the numbers that I put together, and we really are in a tough spot. I'm sitting here in the middle of 2012. Actually, let me retract. We're now in the fourth quarter of fiscal 2012. And comparing the model that I put together, we should have this year, or did have in my model, around $750, $780 billion deficit. The reality is $1.2 trillion. I want you to think on those numbers. throughout the rest of the week, and then decide whether you want to go back and listen to Eaglenomics episode 2 and 3 back to back and think about what I've said if you didn't follow it. So anyhow, if you would like to purchase The Eagle is Crashed, clearpeakpress.com. You can also get it in both paperback and electronic form from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. You can get it in ebook format from Smashwords, the Sony Store, iTunes Store, and other retailers. Thank you for sitting in here with me. Have a nice week, and we'll get back together next Sunday.